They called him the Beast of Rome, the tyrant who murdered his own mother, burned his capital to the ground, and sang while the flames devoured it. He imagined himself a god, a poet, a charioteer, and the greatest actor who ever lived. But when his reign ended, it wasn't in glory or in a blaze of imperial defiance. No, Nero's last days were a pitiful, desperate spiral, ending not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but in a ditch outside the city he once ruled, trembling in fear, abandoned by almost everyone. And the final moments of Rome's most infamous emperor were so humiliating, so tragically pathetic, that even his enemies almost felt sorry for him. Almost. By the summer of 68 AD, Nero's rule had collapsed. The man who once controlled the known world now found himself friendless, despised, and hunted. His cruelty had made him enemies everywhere, senators humiliated, generals betrayed, and even the Praetorian Guard, his own elite bodyguards, had turned on him. The provinces were in open revolt. In Gaul, a governor named Vindex rose against him. In Spain, Galba, another powerful governor, declared himself emperor. It was the ultimate humiliation the ruler of Rome replaced without even a fight. Nero was in Rome when the news reached him that the Senate had declared him a public enemy. The punishment? Death, not the clean, noble kind, but a slow, torturous execution reserved for traitors. His instinct wasn't to stand and fight. It wasn't to rally loyal forces. It was to run. The night before his escape, Nero paced the halls of the palace, muttering half lines of poetry, imagining scenes where he could die in heroic fashion, a grand speech, a tragic farewell. But courage wasn't something he possessed. His fear of pain was legendary. When his secretary suggested suicide to avoid capture, he paled and shuddered. He preferred to think about lines for his final performance instead. At dawn, he fled the city in disguise, dressed in shabby clothes, his face partially covered with a handkerchief, accompanied by just a few loyal freedmen. Rome, the city he claimed to love, didn't even notice his departure. No crowds chased him, no soldiers tried to stop him. The streets were just indifferent. The emperor, who had once commanded legions, now rode out like a fugitive thief, terrified of recognition. His destination was the villa of Phaon, one of his freedmen, about 4 miles outside Rome. The road was hot and dusty, and Nero kept asking if they could take side paths to avoid being seen. At one point, he heard distant horse hooves and panicked, convinced they were soldiers sent to arrest him. They were just farmers heading to market. Still, his paranoia only deepened. When they arrived at the villa, Nero's fear turned to exhaustion. He collapsed onto a couch, drinking water, mumbling about fate. Then he asked, almost childlike, "Is this the place I am to die?" His companions said nothing. The sound of distant riders grew louder. Word had spread the Senate's men were coming. This is where history gets almost unbearably tragic. Nero had spent his life surrounded by flattery and power, but when the moment came to meet his end, he couldn't even bring himself to do it. He begged his companions to help him take his own life. None of them moved. He tried to work up the courage, repeating the line from one of his own plays, "What an artist dies in me." He meant it. Even in his final moments, he thought of himself as a performer, not a ruler. The riders were close now. Dust rose from the road. Nero, trembling, placed a dagger against his throat but couldn't press. He sobbed. He asked one of his companions to set the example and stab himself first. They refused. He accused them of cowardice. Though everyone could see the truth, the coward was Nero. Finally, hearing the hoofbeats almost at the gate, he forced himself forward with the help of a servant named Epaphroditus. Together they drove the blade into his neck. The pain was instant, and Nero let out a long, pitiful groan. It wasn't quick. He lay bleeding, gasping, muttering about how unfair it was. His last words, "Too late! This is fidelity!" A sarcastic jab at his companions for not dying with him sooner. Moments later, he was gone. The news reached Rome quickly. There was no great mourning, no solemn procession. His body was hurriedly cremated by a few loyal women from his household and buried quietly in the family tomb. For most Romans, his death was a relief. For the Senate, it was the closing of a shameful chapter. And for history, it became one of the most infamous endings of any ruler, not in a blaze of defiance, but in fear, cowardice, and self-pity. Nero had once believed he would be remembered as a genius, a god among men, a ruler of destiny. Instead, he is remembered as the emperor who burned Rome, murdered his own family, and died like a frightened child in the dirt outside the city he ruled. History has seen many tyrants, but few have met such a humiliating end. And maybe that's fitting. For all his grand performances, for all the gold and marble, the music and the power, Nero was, in the end, just a man terrified of pain and abandoned by those who once bowed before him. If you think Nero's death was pathetic, just wait until you hear about the bizarre fates of other Roman emperors, from one who was murdered by his own wrestling partner to another who was assassinated in the middle of a horse race. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the darkest, strangest stories from history.